Welcome into the Autzen Audibles podcast. I'm Matt Prehm, Erik Skopil, Jared Mack on the show. Welcome to your Monday, or maybe it's a Tuesday when you listen to this show. January 10th, National Championship Day. Oregon's head coach, Dan Lanning, will be coaching his final game later tonight. Georgia Bulldogs against the Alabama Crimson Tide. And on today's show, we're going to kind of look at the action that he's been doing behind the scenes at Oregon the last couple of weeks, landing a couple of transfers. We already know Bo Nix is in the fold, but we've talked about Bo Nix at length here, so we're probably not going to spend too much time on him. But they've added two other guys, and we felt like we needed to discuss this. And I think it's important additions, especially on the defensive side of the football. Washington defensive tackle Sam Tiamani, who has started, I think, 18 games in his career at Washington. And then they also added Christian Gonzalez, 18 straight starts for Colorado. At cornerback, was a 4-star safety out of Texas prior to going to Colorado. Two additions that I think you could just look, maybe to brush broad strokes here. DJ James, Jason Jones out. Gonzalez, Tiamani in.
Yeah, I mean, it's not obviously quite that simple, but it feels that simple in terms of positions being addressed. And I now think basically 3 of the 4 position groups I think needed to be addressed in the portal have been. The only one remaining being receiver. Obviously, I think a quarterback was needed. And I think the positions, like you said, because you lost a couple guys to transfer at defensive tackle and at corner, you needed to address it. And I thought Oregon went out, and I'm not going to say it's an upgrade at corner, because I think DJ James is a really good player. I should know, though, Christian Gonzalez was honorable mention all Pac-12. DJ James was not. So according to the coaches in the conference, at least, Gonzalez is considered the superior player. I also like just really kind of initial reactions to the kind of body types. Like Christian Gonzalez, now, if you pair him with Trikweze Bridges, is that the biggest corners Oregon's ever had at 6'2" and 6'3", both over 200 pounds, like big, strong, sturdy frame bodies. Kind of a little bit of a difference from what we've seen. I know they've, the last couple of years, 5'11", 6 foot, maybe 6'1", but a little leaner body types. These are two guys, by the way, who were recruited to play safety at both schools that have both moved to corner and both kind of have that body type. These are both basically safeties playing corner. And you think about the body types we've already talked about at the safety position. Oregon in the secondary could be like exclusively 6'2", 6'3", everybody's over 200 pounds, and just be a bunch of big, physical guys. And that maybe helps a lot in run support. So from just the additions, just kind of off the cuff, I really like Gonzalez in terms of fitting next to Bridges and how that could work, or maybe next to Manning, depending on who wins that job. Manning is a smaller body type compared to Bridges and Gonzalez, but I think it's a really interesting pairing. I think it was a needed one. I think the fact that there is obviously experience between Demetrius Martin, Oregon's new corners coach, and Gonzalez, who he coached last year at Colorado, last couple of years, that's really helpful too. I mean, there's continuity here, and really, I mean, you're seeing now continuity with all of those transfers. There's at least somebody currently on the staff who's worked on at the same program they've been at. Bo Nix and Dillingham at Auburn, and I know it's offense defense, but even Junior Adams and Sam Tiamani at Washington has some sort of experience. So there's a little bit of an overlay here from a player coaching perspective, which I like as well. Oregon at D tackle, just really quickly, they are so deep now. I don't even know if Tiamani starts, even though he was somebody who
probably not.
I mean, Popo and Dorless are going to make it tough. So really, really, I think positive additions. Obviously, I think there's more work to be done in terms of adding players, but great start. Great start for a staff that doesn't even have its head coach fully in Eugene yet to get these kind of players settled in. Like this is pretty impressive stuff, I think.
100%.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt. You want me to touch on the full-time coaching staff here?
Yeah.
Or is that what you were going to do? Yeah. So basically, as soon as we started this podcast, Oregon officially announced Tosh Lupoy as their defensive coordinator. It was funny because right before the pod, it's like, we'll wait to talk about the coaches once they announce. And then 30 seconds in, the full-time on-field coaching staff for new head coach Dan Lanning is now officially official. And so Lupoy obviously was coaching the Jacksonville Jaguars defensive line. Season ended yesterday. Jaguars weren't so hot, but this means that that Oregon can now officially take him away from Jacksonville and bring him to Eugene. It was reported earlier this week that he was signing a 3-year, $5.1 million deal to become their defensive coordinator, $1.7 million a year. And now he's official. He's going to be coming to Eugene under Dan Lanning and bringing his recruiting services with him.
I think on Wednesday we'll dive full scope into this coaching staff, but we'll keep charging on with this podcast, looking at the additions that they've added. And Erik, you brought up the fact that you don't even know if Sam will start at defensive line for Oregon, and I think that in of itself tells you the depth that they now have and why this is such a big addition, because Pro Football Focus released their grades for the 2021 season in the Pac-12. And among interior defensive linemen, Oregon now has the top 2 guys, Popo Amabe, Brandon Dorless, and they have 3 of the top 5 interior defensive linemen in the Pac-12 returning in 2022. So I think you look at this D-line with Popo, Brandon, Sam, and then you throw in Keon Ware-Hudson, who played quite a bit, Christian Williams, who has played quite a bit, and now all of a sudden you've got a really strong rotation and the depth that's necessary to play football at a high level up front and in the trenches. And I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that, hey, Oregon should be really stout against the run in 2022. And that should help everything on the defense in the back end. Like I don't want to come out here and say Oregon's defensive line should automatically make Oregon's overall defense a top 5 defense in the country. But I really think because of the addition of Sam, the depth that they have in the interior and what they have around the defensive line, I think it's safe to say that this should be a really good season for Oregon on defense in 2022. And I'll be pretty disappointed if they've got major deficiencies on that side of the football.
Well, especially with the staff you're just seeing come into place here. I mean, Dan Lanning is a defensive coach who's been extremely highly respected nationally. And I think we've talked about this before. If this team is markedly better on offense than defense, and defense is, like you said, has some deficiencies and maybe it just isn't very good, I think that's going to be very problematic for Dan to kind of come out. And that's going to be his side of the football. You know, Tosh Lupoy might have just been hired to be the defensive coordinator. Tosh will have his prints all over the defense, I'm sure, as will co-defensive coordinator Matt Prehm. But this is ultimately, Dan's going to have a huge role with this group. I don't think there's any question about it. And if they are lacking, that is going to be largely on his shoulders, or at least that's going to be the perception, fair or not. So I expect this to be a good defense almost regardless of some of the personnel stuff. That's probably a little unfair. But I think if they get all of this shored up, they could be a very good defense and one of the more, competitive defense the Pac-12, that Oregon has had in the last couple of years, I should say. Maybe I shouldn't say the Pac-12 has had, but this could be a very strong defense. I don't think there's any question about it. And the depth in the interior line is great. Obviously, I am very high on what you have at linebacker and what you have at safety. I continue to be concerned at corner, but a guy like Gonzalez shores that up for me. You bring in somebody who can at least say they've been a starting corner in Power 5 football and not been bad, been honorable mention all conference. I was just looking through the Pac-12 honorable mention. I think obviously there are 4 players on the first and second team at corner. So that's 4 players that are considered better than him, but only 5 other players join him on honorable mention at corner. So they're saying he's one of the 10 best corners in the Pac-12.
Yep.
Not an elite, but that means he's one of the, he's a top guy. And this is as a second year freshman too. So the upside's really high here. I like this addition. Personally, I wouldn't hate seeing another addition from a corner spot. By the way, his teammate, fellow starting corner at Colorado, Mekhi Blackman, also entered the portal. I'd be curious to see this coach just bring his 2 starting corners from Colorado over to Oregon. We're not reporting that, but hypothetically, could be funny. There's obvious connections there with his former starter and his former position coach at Oregon now. So could Blackman be someone to join? He was also honorable mention all conference. So kind of similar footing those two had. that's kind of a name I'm at least monitoring. I don't know if what the background is there necessarily, but there's certainly kind of the basics that make sense for why that could work out. And I think if you're Oregon, I think you want a little bit more experience. I think you need to add a couple more players. As we talked about, there's not a lot of experience period from this group. So corner is the real concern for me on defense still. I feel really good about everything else. I guess I still want to know where the pass rush is coming off the edge. Probably. I mean, I think that it's going to be difficult to replace production from Kayvon Thibodeau. But overall, I agree, Matt. The defense is coming together and it's coming into shape. And I think you look and go with someone like Dan Lanning and someone like Tosh Lupoy and some of the other coaches on staff, taking the veterans there. This defense, and there's no reason. There are very little excuses that this defense should be very, very good next year. And that, again, that Oregon should be highly competitive in all of its games because of it.
I agree. I mean, this defense was a good rush defense last year. Obviously, passing defense was less than satisfactory. A lot of that goes into the injuries that they suffered early in the season. And honestly, a lot of the defensive deficiencies, in my opinion, were because of the injuries that they suffered really early into the season. We've been over this a million times, but converting Jeffrey Bassa from a safety to a linebacker, having to play Keith Brown when he probably wasn't ready, having to play former walk-on Nate Hukliani a lot of snaps in basically 8 or 9 games during the season. That could have severe issues on your defense and the total capabilities that they have and the ceiling that they have. But bringing in Tamani and Gonzalez, those guys shore up some positions where you might have needed a little more depth, especially at cornerback, obviously. Erik touched on how stacked the interior defensive line is right now, where Tamani, who's a 18-game starter at Washington, something like that, probably doesn't start this year, barring an injury with Popo and Brandon Dorlus. That's impressive. Tamani had 43 tackles this past season at Washington as a defensive lineman or interior defensive lineman, which is pretty tough to do. That being said, Washington's defense wasn't great against the run, so a lot of teams were going right up the middle and giving him opportunities to tackle. He had a 9-tackle game against Oregon State. I don't know when the last time you guys saw an interior defensive lineman have 9 tackles in a game, but he did it. I think this defense could be really good. I think they will be really good in the run game. I worry about them in the passing game for cornerbacks, obviously, just the depth there. I like Gonzalez. I haven't watched too much tape on him, but just from general points of what I've seen and how he's graded on PFF, not that PFF means everything, but I do, I'm an analytical guy, so I do like to look at those. I think he could be a welcomed addition. I would hope that he can be somewhat up to caliber that the DJ James was, because I do really like DJ James as a player. I worry about the passing defense just because of corners and the potential inability to create a pass rush. And until I see that it happens in front of my own 2 eyes, where Oregon can dependably create a pass rush without Kayvon Thibodeau on its roster, I won't believe it. So until that first game, until that spring game, whatever the case may be, where I see Braden Swinson has turned into a monster or somebody has stepped up and become a much better player, or Oregon goes to the transfer portal and lands somebody, or one of their new freshmen comes in is just way better than everybody else had anticipated. I don't necessarily know that they'll be able to provide a consistent pass rush, because now taking place of Kayvon Thibodeau as the best pass rusher on the team is Brandon Dorlus, who's going to be an interior lineman. So it's already going to be harder to get a pass rush, and teams will double team him like they did with Thibodeau. He doesn't have a version of Brandon Dorlus on the edge to really help him out, at least not yet. And so that's what I'm worried about the most when it comes to this defense. But if they find somebody who can just, maybe it's a trio of people who can replicate the potential impact that Thibodeau had, I think they can be a good defense. It's just depending on if they can do that. And that's a lot to ask, because you're replacing a potential top 3 NFL draft pick in Thibodeau. But even still, I don't know if they have just an elite pass rusher on this roster yet. And with that, I'm still worried about that in that sense, but I do think the run defense will be good. I think the middle linebacker play, or linebacker play in general, is going to be outstanding. Hopefully, Justin Flo comes back fully healthy from his injury. we may finally, knock on wood, we may finally get to see a full season of Justin Flo and Noah Sewell, which would be spectacular. But yeah, those are my two concerns. I think that those are about it, I would say. Feel good about safety, linebacker, defensive line, other than edge and corner.
I just had one thing on the pass rush because I've done a little Dan Lanning read up. He uses simulated pressures at a higher rate than any other school in the country. What that does is it's kind of like you're bringing pressures from unexpected places. And you have the guys drop back. And so maybe what Oregon does is they simulate the pass rush, not from a traditional Braden Swinson's just going to beat this guy one-on-one, but they're bringing players from all over the place. And it's just very exotic, unexpected. I mean, Oregon does have the athletes to do that. And maybe that's how they get away with lacking that go-to kind of elite pass rusher. It's just a thought I've had kind of as we talk through this, because I do have this. I think we all have the same concerns about replacing that with one player. It's probably not going to be done. Maybe they can find a way to just get creative, and it's a collection of guys at the second level that are whether it be bringing Bennett Williams out as a safety, to rush and dropping a guy into coverage in place of him or something. Right. So just that could be something that could play into it too.
One thing that I really like about Christian Gonzalez is the fact that he'll have 3 years of eligibility. Starting next season. Now, granted, he could technically go pro after the 2022 football season if he wanted to, because that would be his third year removed from high school football. It's a little wonky because of COVID, but I like the fact that both Tiamani and Gonzalez have multiple years of eligibility remaining if they want to use it. And it's not just a 1 year stopgap. Could you argue that there's a positive aspect of taking a one and done transfer? Yeah, absolutely. It keeps turning the roster over and gives you an opportunity to be good in 22 with depth, and yet it doesn't hurt you long term. But I think with both of these guys, they're players that you look at and say they could be multi-year starters at Oregon. It's not like you're plucking someone and saying, they're going to be the fifth cornerback for 3 years at Oregon. That those are different types of additions, which kind of segues into the second part of this podcast here. Oregon's roster is starting to fill up here a little bit. I think they've got one available scholarship to use at their disposal before any transfer has to happen from someone on the roster. And look, or someone goes pro. Like, we don't know what Travis Dye or CJ Verdell are going to do. We don't know if DJ Johnson has pulled his name out of the NFL draft, or Carson Battles has pulled his name out of the NFL draft, because those players, guys that are going to be seniors in 2022, they are automatically entered into the NFL draft, and they have to remove themselves from it if they want to come back to school. We don't know yet. We won't know for a while unless they announce it themselves. But so there could be a couple more, departures for the draft. I don't think anyone really is expecting anyone besides Verdell or Dye. And then there's transfers, and there's plenty of them that could happen. We're not going to speculate on specifically who, but that could open up a couple more spots for Oregon and Dan Lanning and his staff to go out and find players. And I almost think, guys, there's maybe a couple of high school players worth going after this second period, but most of the work should be done via transfer, in my eyes, of trying to fill holes on this roster.
Yeah, I'll be very curious to see where they go. I mean, I think we opened the podcast and I talked about how I thought they'd addressed basically 3 of the 4 position groups that were needed. And, I think I went into the offseason thinking, let's go. You need to find a quarterback. You need to find receivers, which is where you need to go next. And then defensively, interior defensive line, and then some cornerback help. And like I said, 3 out of 4 are down. I think it'll be very interesting to see where they go in the portal at receiver, or if they go after prep players. Arliss Boardingham is a player we know as a prep. Brandon Rice is a player who's in the portal right now that has probably got some interest from Oregon. I would assume has interest himself in Oregon. I think he's making a decision this week.
Wednesday.
Wednesday. So that could shore up some of that. We should note, by the way, that Oregon did make a pair of 2022 defensive back offers this past week. I've got it in my recapping. Kamari Terrell and Miguel, I believe it's Mitchell. a couple of defensive backs. So those are kind of names to know going forward. But yeah, no, receiver, you have to add. You do. You just have to add. You can't come away with 6, 7 guys if we're going to include Delgado in the mix. We keep including Seven McGee at receiver while he's, I think, probably a little bit of both receiver and running back, and probably some of where he plays is going to be dependent upon what they bring in around him. I think receiver is a big need to me, and I'm not going to sit here and say where it's going to come from because, frankly, we don't know. But I think you have to bring in at least one, probably 2 guys, whether it be freshman or portal, to just sort of solidify that position group, because the last thing you want is injuries to hit you hard like we've seen this year. And now you're relying on walk-ons, or maybe you're starting now suddenly guys you've brought in as purely depth pieces. Like you don't have a lot of room to work around with. So you got to add some guys. And I think personally, a Boardingham with his size is interesting.
Yeah.
I also think you've got great speed, but I wouldn't mind going and finding like a straight track speed kind of burner guy who can really take the top off. Obviously, we saw a little bit of that with Thornton and Franklin and Hudson at the end of the year, and maybe this is me just overlooking the fact that Oregon didn't seem like they threw it deep very often. So I'm minimizing some of the traits that some of these guys have. But I don't know if I go into the year feeling wholly confident that they have that top end guy who can really stretch the defense consistently. And I think that's something to maybe take a look at as well.
Yeah, Matt, I 100% agree with you, where I think Oregon has to look through the portal more than it does through like the high school, the prep level. I think specifically they got to look for guys who have multiple years of eligibility left, not just a one and done player, a grad transfer. And yeah, shoring up the wide receiver room, as Erik mentioned, I think is priority number one. Again, we all like their top 3 of Thornton, Franklin, and Hudson. And even their top 4, if you want to include Seven McGee as a true slot wide receiver. I think all of those guys can play. They showed it at the Alamo Bowl. They showed it a bit against Oregon State. Those guys are talented. Franklin was a borderline 5-star prospect. Thornton was a high 4-star prospect. Chris Hudson was a 4-star prospect coming out of high school. These guys are really talented. And Chris Hudson was remarkable at the end of the season. He was kind of like second, third string guy who didn't get a lot of playing time. But once Johnny Johnson and Jalen Redd and Pittman left the program, once those guys went out, he immediately stepped up and really played well. So that has me cautiously optimistic for next year in terms of his potential and his growth. I just really like him as a player. He's a smooth route runner and really gets downhill fast, and it's really evasive too, elusive, I should say. But even still, it's just the depth behind. I don't know. They probably, what is there, like 6 or 7 viable wide receivers right now on the roster?
If you include
Something
7.
like that.
If you include 7, it's 8 guys.
That's just too little. Because, Oregon lost Jalen Redd and Johnny Johnson in 2 weeks, and Pittman in the 2 weeks. That's 3. So technically, if you were going to go next season, have 3 guys get season-ending injuries, you'd have 5 dudes. Just not nearly enough. So
not enough.
Yeah, they probably need at least 3 more guys. I think the portal is where to hit it. Maybe 2 portals, 1 high school kid, I think would probably be the most ideal. If you get those portal guys have extra years of eligibility. But they just need someone who can make an immediate impact if one of their 3 or 4 top guys go down. Because the depth behind could be talented and is talented, but it's relatively unproven. And so if you can get somebody who just has a year of experience, has played 9 games, has like 20 catches, that's all you could really need. You just need somebody who knows football, who knows how to play at the collegiate and the Power 5 level specifically.
Now, I agree with Jared, the type of player that he's talking about. But I honestly think they could raid their own roster for one of those players, for one of those 3 players. Because I agree, you got to hit the portal. You got to maybe add 1 high school guy. But Brian Addison is on this roster, and he has started games at receiver. And in 2019, he had 18 receptions for 203 yards and 1 touchdown. He played in all 14 games for the Ducks that year. And I look at that and I kind of think he was supposed to be what we saw from Devin Williams in 2020 and 2021. we all had high hopes for him, and we're optimistic that he would kind of turn into this big play receiver threat. And I kind of wonder if we're going to see that play out a second time at Oregon, where he shifts back to offense to fill one of those spots. Because I be real here, he's probably not going to play a lot over Bennett Williams, Jamal Hill, Steve Stevens, and now you throw in a Jeffrey Bassa. We already know Damon David was getting in a little bit ahead of him as well. Playing time will be hard, I think, and you have a log jam at that position and a need at another one that he's played before. I think it makes too much sense for Addison not to at least try that move again.
It's the Dawood Davis experience all over again, really. I mean, just moving guys back and forth between offense, defense, similar position groups. I think Brian has proven to be valuable in both areas, but not an extraordinary talent in either thus far, I think is the fair way of saying it. And I don't think that's too much of a slight, because he was moved to defensive back because they didn't think he was going to play receiver. And now we're talking about doing the inverse because playing time is hard at defensive back. It's been hard for him to kind of get his footing. And who knows? Maybe you're right. Maybe he really just needs to come back to offense and it'll work out. I don't know. I do think my idea. I don't think he's a super high ceiling player at receiver.
True,
but I think you need bodies, and I don't have any doubt he can be productive if you throw him out there. I don't question that really at all. But also, I'm not sure I'm expecting him to move over and be more than your fifth, sixth, or seventh best wide receiver, just based upon what he's done so far. I hope I'm wrong, but definitely an interesting name to watch.
I mean, it would be worth taking the risk on. I think that he has experience playing with Oregon as a wide receiver and as in the secondary, obviously, where he played last year. But like Erik said, you just kind of need bodies at this point. And maybe this time around something clicks, or maybe it doesn't, and he's just somebody who can get you 20 catches in a year and just provide you an option on if someone's banged up and he can go get you some snaps. Or, he still has top-end speed. He can still be a deep guy threat. That's why they throw him at safety, is because he can go track down balls. Whether or not he's the best at it on the team, probably not, but he could still potentially be an asset, be a weapon for this team. But yeah, I think most importantly, this is all about getting bodies into the wide receiver room, people who know how to play the position, people who have played the position at the Power 5 level, who have experience in running offensive sets. And if Brian is up for it, I think they should do it. It just, I don't know. I feel bad for the kid just going back and forth because he was, a top 100 recruit out of high school, or just about. And for him to go from, being from the safety to wide receiver, safety, and going back and forth, I do kind of feel bad for him in that sense. But this is a new staff. Maybe if the team were still in Mario Cristobal, that doesn't happen in terms of moving him back. But I think this staff needs to do whatever is best for the wide receiver room. And if that means moving him back, I think they're going to at least talk to him about it and see if that can happen.
Aside from the receiver room, I don't really know if there's another position where you'd say definitively they need to go out and find a transfer on either end of the roster. I mean, I think you could maybe argue the value of like an inside linebacker, maybe another cornerback. But I don't know if there's any other position group where you're sitting here saying they're screwed if they don't add anybody. They've got enough depth at some spots, but there's certainly a few, like I said, linebacker, corner, where it maybe would be beneficial, but you can get by with what you have.
I'd address corner. I don't know about line. I don't know. I'm not as concerned at linebacker. I think adding bodies is helpful because we just saw this last year. A lack of depth really impact things. I also think that was just incredibly bad luck because I actually thought they were really deep at inside linebacker going into the year, and then suddenly they were moving defensive backs over. I mean, so maybe you learn from that and you do take another guy out of the portal. I just think corner remains a position to address. And I will say if Jaleel Florence, another top 70 corner recruit nationally, and I should say top 70 national recruit, not top 70 corner. ranked I think under 70th nationally. He's considering Oregon, and if he gets back in the fold and he picks Oregon, I think I feel okay about things because you got your veteran guy in Gonzalez, and now you have your two big-time prep recruits and the two Jaleels, high school teammates out of Lincoln and San Diego, in Tucker and Florence, probably set there. But I still think corner is a position. I know Gonzalez is a nice addition. I really like the addition, as I've said. I still would like to see at least another body or two brought in to kind of shore that up. I still don't know exactly what you have. And if you're trying to talk about winning really high level in Dan Lanning's first year, to me, you need to still continue to make some, build that roster a little bit in the second. I'm just a little concerned still about corner, but not overly concerned. I feel better with the Gonzalez addition.
I feel better with the Gonzalez addition as well, but you absolutely need to continue to provide depth there. Right now, they don't have anybody who's like a significant lockdown corner. Gonzalez is probably moves into that role immediately as the number one, maybe. I mean, there'll probably be a competition between him, Bridges, and Manning. Statistically speaking, like Gonzalez is probably the best of the three. And that could all change over the summer and over spring ball and everything like that. But corner continues to be a position of need that they need to get some depth and some talent in there. Linebacker this is kind of like a PTSD thing from this last season. I've kind of felt the same way, Matt, about linebacker. But knocking on wood again, everybody should come back healthy from that room. Obviously, they lose Drew Mathis because he's graduating. You still have Flo, Keith Brown, Noah Sewell, Jackson LeDuc, and then you still have two incoming recruits and Devin Jackson, Harrison Taggart at linebacker. So that'll provide some more depth. Just depending on their scholarship allowance, I guess. Maybe you hit another linebacker just in absolute fear of what happened last year. But I think other than that, there's not another position group that obviously pops out. I'd like to see them go after an edge rusher if there is somebody in the portal. I've talked about this before, but if you're a good edge rusher at a decent school, you're probably not going to leave just because you're top dog there. There's no reason to leave. You're not going to see a first string guy from Auburn or LSU or something like that hit the portal more often than not. If Oregon could find a diamond in the rough, like a group of five guy who hits the portal and is looking for a new opportunity, sure, I would take a flyer on that and just see what he can do. But that would be the only other position that I would really like to see Oregon hit. I had talked about how I wanted to see them hit offensive line depending on who came back. Everybody but George Moore is back, so I think the depth there is pretty astounding, and it should be remarkable. It should be exactly the same as it was this year in terms of depth, where we saw Oregon go through 8 or 9 offensive linemen in games. So that's not worrisome. Quarterback seems to be pretty deep, maybe get one more, but I think I'd rather go prep than transfer portal. Maybe a tight end if there's some guy out there who can really make an impact, but I do like who's at the tight end position group right now. I could go through the whole roster, so I'll probably stop now. But just cornerbacks and for the love of God, maybe just another linebacker to save us in our sanity.
All right, that's going to do it for us here on this edition of the Odds and Audibles podcast. Next up, we will record a Wednesday show breaking down this coaching staff, our thoughts on the full staff as it's now been announced. All position coaches are in. We've got some recruiting coaching hires that have been made, and it's a big name on this list. So we'll break through that. We'll also discuss a little bit down the road of just Dan Lanning's, what he faces now at Oregon now that his time at Georgia would be up. So look for those to come on the podcast feed here in the next couple of days, week or so. And until then, you've been listening to the Odds and Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.